said, if you find a good fight, get in. And I believe the fight for the human right to water is a good fight.
And this is Poison and Power, the Fight for Water, a moral courage project, a partnership of the University of Dayton Human Rights Center and Proof, Media for Social Justice.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be moderating this important panel today with such distinguished and really inspiring speakers and panelists. I want to thank the Human Rights Center and all those who worked so hard to make this event possible. My time at UD goes back far enough when I recall the origins of this award. I was visiting campus after having graduated, and while I was in the political science department, I remember the energy and the conversations that people were having who were conceiving this award. And there was just so much energy to it and pride and urgency, frankly, to honor a man who's now a saint who had paid the ultimate price for his beliefs and his sacrifices. Today, I believe the Romero Award is more timely and more relevant than ever. Saint Romero's father, as you probably know, wanted him to become a carpenter because he knew how to fix things. Never has there been a time more in needing of fixes than now. We have deep racial wounds that need to heal. We have environmental challenges that threaten our planet and even our existence. And we have resource gaps that deeply divide those who have from those who have not. When a military junta seized power in El Salvador in 1979, Archbishop Romero began broadcasting weekly sermons over the radio. He openly criticized the regime and those supporting it, denouncing cases of abduction, torture, and mass murder. That is when he became known as the voice of those without a voice. And that is what is needed today more than ever. Not to speak on behalf of others, but to use our voices of privilege and power to create space for others and for their voices to be heard. Let us recall as we open this event the words of Saint Romero, who said, "Aspire not to have more, but to be more." I look to this event today and the people who are gathered here who are inspiring us all to be more through the example of their lives and their work. Let me now introduce Rob Broderick, who is going to lead us in a prayer. And Rob has earned a Bachelor of Science and a Master's in Theology from the University of Dayton, as well as a doctorate in Systematic Theology from Boston College. While in Dayton, Rob founded the Mission of Mary Cooperative, a nonprofit urban farming initiative in Dayton, so important, that provides food access, nutrition education, and native land restoration services. Now, Rob serves as Senior Program Manager for the Partnership Center Limited, where he works on youth homelessness. So let me now turn to Rob.
Thanks, Ann. It's an honor to be with all of you today and to lead this reflection on the Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero, whose vision of the church and world is the inspiration for our gathering here today. Our upcoming panel will be discussing ways in which human rights law can promote environmental protection for local communities across the Western Hemisphere. Before we begin that conversation, I would like to set a certain stage by reflecting for a moment on Archbishop Romero's understanding of the political and spiritual dimension of what it means to be a community or a people. After becoming ordained as the Archbishop of San Salvador, Romero would describe an experience of having been converted to and by the people, by which he very specifically meant the popular majorities made up of the people living in inhumane conditions of poverty, those who struggle on behalf of the poor, and those who identify with the cause of the poor. Moreover, it was Romero's identification with the people and advancement of the cause of the people that led to his assassination on March 24th, 1980. What I would like to draw out for today is a particular aspect of Romero meant when he described the people and had converted him, and on whose behalf his life was given. This word, people, is so commonplace that it's easy to overlook how many different ways in which it's used or how many different meanings it's given. Indeed, many of the greatest political conflicts we have seen in modern history have, in one way or the other, involved contested notions of what it means to be a people or to work on behalf of the people. There are two aspects of Romero's example of what it means to be with and for the people that I believe are germane to our conversation today. The first is what I have already mentioned, that the people are those who are victimized by poverty, struggle on behalf of the poor, and identify personally with the cause of the popular masses who suffer daily from the inhumane conditions of poverty. This aspect is of the utmost importance, and it can never be overstated. But there's a second aspect which may well be as important, and that is the way in which, when Romero talks about the people, he always means an actual, living, breathing people, rather than an abstract ideal. Perhaps this sounds obvious or intuitive, but I promise it is not. On all ends of the political spectrum, from the most progressive left to the most conservative right, the most common political use of the term people is to use it as an abstraction, that is, as a mere imagination of what we might believe a nation or a class or a group ought to be, rather than who they are in the concrete unfolding of history. It's a great difficulty to conduct the politics of state and of law without such abstractions. Indeed, many political theorists will argue that's impossible, and they may well be right. Without performing the cognitive reduction that goes out of many, one, how is it possible to govern and litigate on behalf of a we, such as in the US Constitution's we the people, when in fact that we is composed of dramatically different individuals with different backgrounds, interests, actions, emotions, demographics, and so forth? When those identities and interests do not align, or even more challenging, when those individuals have internal dramatic conflicts, in large part due to the limits of the politics around them and the trauma of what has been done to them. It's not possible to answer these questions here, but it is possible to at least acknowledge the reality witnessed by Romero and witnessed by many of us gathered here today for a discussion and ceremony carried out in his name. That law and governance will surely need to continue engaging other social spheres that constitute and represent the people. Only through such engagement is it possible to empower a people, in Romero's understanding of the word, who are constituted by and for the poor and who are not reduced to an abstract idea of the poor. And what's more, if we are to truly pay homage to Romero's vision, then it's possible to go even one step further and say that it is in the concrete, messy, complex, and diverse struggle with and for such a people, who in fact already exist, precede our individual work and efforts, and are not there to be the objects of the work, but the agents of our own ongoing conversion, that we will encounter what is most sacred. And it is exactly for that reason that Romero did not identify this community only as the people, but moreover, and more importantly, as the people of God. As we continue to discuss and advance human rights law as a means of promoting environmental protection for local communities across the Western Hemisphere, may we be continually reminded of everything Romero represents in his conversion by and advocacy for the people of God. And may this reminder serve us well in the concrete and complex challenges we continue to face today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. What a great way to start us off, and very powerful and inspiring words. So thank you for that. I have the privilege now to introduce Quinn Townsend Riley, who is a poet and a 2016 graduate of the University of Dayton, majoring in communication. While on campus, Quinn was active with Black Action Through Unity and was a member of the first cohort of the Moral Courage Project. Currently, Quinn is pursuing a master's degree at Western Illinois University in college student personnel, and she hopes to work in higher education as a director of multicultural affairs. So let me, without further ado, turn over to Quinn. Welcome, Quinn.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Quinn. I use she, her pronouns. And currently I am in grad school at Western Illinois University. Western Illinois University exists on the lands of the Peoria, Sauk, Missaukee, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux nations. The University of Iowa is located on the territorial lands of the Sioux, Missaukee, Sauk, and Fox and Iowa peoples. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the story of these nations. The histories and dispossession of these nations are related to the growth and expansion of higher education in the U.S. And I want to acknowledge and center Native peoples at the start and throughout my performance. So thank you to Dr. Preuss for this opportunity. I really appreciate him reaching out. Always much love to UD. This poem is a poem that I wrote envisioning my future, where we all are free. And before I start, I would like to take a moment of silence, honestly, to honor the lives lost due to state-sanctioned violence, starting with Dante, right? So if you all could just take about 10 seconds to honor him. Ashe. Okay, so this piece is something that I just wrote. So I am looking at my Google Doc while I am performing it. And you guys can hear me okay? Feel free to say yes or no, because I don't see the chat.
It's very clear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Anne. Okay. It is the year 3000. And Jeff Bezos has been successfully drained of his entire fortune. Now it's given to the people. No Name is chilling with Asada. Marsha P. Johnson has her own school. The tools for revolution are now everyday circumstance. Education, Afrocentrically, is common sense. The only strange fruit around here are the ones that we don't eat because every life matters here. No bars. Besides the ciphers on Sundays, juke parties and sex workers are essential. The earth is happy. Water is finally blue. Good enough to drink without filter for everybody. To uncork the fire hydrant and play in street. Water is no longer a measure of socioeconomic difference. Flint is on some life water stuff. Police, no one knows about that stuff. ICE, no one needs that stuff. Debt, no one has that stuff. It's all equity and inclusion, freedom over here. People are actually smiling and meaning it. Black people are actually living and creating without no one stealing it or them. No more lists of names to remember because Brianna's or anyone's can sleep. Black girls, femme, and gender non-conforming folks are decorated with crowns and jewels, not bullets or defamatory language. Diverse learners are learning. Those without access are here, and the queers are loud and proud, giving castle and throne. There are no mainstream beauty standards. We all admit to having body hair. Legs are unshaved. Everything is named and sex is talked about. People can do what they want and not worry about anybody finding out. You can curse and pray. You can smoke and drink and you can think because people are free. The people are free of social construct, of shame, of microaggression, of systemic regression, of racism repetitions. We are here living the world that Octavia penned about, that Fanny fought for, a world our ancestors dreamed of wildly. The people have the power. We all sit in circles and talk, and we eat everything from fruit to flaming hots, because this is a space where duality is embraced. Because today, the people are the future. Ashe. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity. and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the event. Thank you.
And that was so beautiful and really wonderful to hear your original work. And thank you for performing it for us. So let's all give her a round of applause for that. Thank you so much. And now I am going to turn to the panel event. And before I do that, I'm going to introduce each panelist in the order in which they'll speak so that you know who you have the privilege of hearing from. And then we're going to turn to some questions that you can either put in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will see them. And we will get to that at the later half of the event. So please be thinking of your questions as our panelists are speaking. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm Ann Hudock. I'm the CEO and president of Counterpart International. And we are a global organization and been around for 56 years doing work in lots of different areas, but we currently do have work I'll mention in El Salvador on a justice program and bringing justice to those who've been disappeared. I'm also a two-time UD grad, and I am a proud member of the Human Rights Advisory Council. So it is just a great privilege to introduce this panel and to kick us off. I want to give you a little bit of background. We have assembled this panel with 4 really dynamic speakers, and they have experience and expertise drawn from really across different spaces, from local and grassroots to federal and regional levels of governance, and from up and down the Western Hemisphere. And our hope in convening this panel is really to put activists and organizers in dialogue with legal scholars and human rights practitioners on issues that are at the intersection of environmental protection and Indigenous rights. So as I mentioned, our format today, we're going to have about 10 minutes of remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll turn to the questions. So again, if you think of something during the chat, during the presentations, please flag it, put it in the Q&A, and we will definitely do our best to get to it during the latter section with questions and answers. So let me start by introducing Megan Hess. She is a rural organizing director with We the People of Michigan, a statewide progressive organization. She was born and raised in the Upper Peninsula, and she is a member of the Salt Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Megan got started in community organizing in the fight to shut down the Enbridge Pipeline 5, which she viewed as a threat to Indigenous rights and to environmental sustainability. So welcome to Megan. Andrea Hain is a Mapuche-Huilliche community social psychologist in southern Chile and a member of the Ethical Commission Against Torture. The commission is a human rights organization in Chile that was founded in 2001 to safeguard human rights in the post-dictatorship era and to advocate for justice, reparation, and historical memory. And Andrea, I'm going to encourage you to tell us what historical memory is because it's so important. Michaelyn Steele is professor of law at the J. Reuben Clark School of Brigham Young University and a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians of New York. Professor Steele's career has included private practice representation of Indian tribes, decorated years as a trial attorney in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and time spent as a counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Larry Echo Hawk, at the US Department of Interior. Michaelyn, welcome. So glad that you could be with us. And we have Soledad Garcia Munoz, who since 2017 has served as the inaugural Special Rapporteur for Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Of Argentine nationality, Ms. Munoz is an attorney with broad experience across the human rights field, including with Amnesty International, the International Organization for Migration, and numerous other UN agencies. So you can see why I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today because we have so many wonderful people and so much to talk about. So I am going to start. I'm going to ask people to turn on their videos if they will. That way everyone can see the full panel. And let me start with Megan. Megan, I wonder if you could reflect on your work with your organization and your background in the fights for environmental justice and how your own identity shapes your work.
Absolutely, and thanks so much, Anne, for the introduction, and to everyone who's joining virtually today. Super excited for the opportunity to speak here, and just like a special shout out of gratitude for the folks who are doing the invisible logistics work behind the scenes. That's always a tough job. I've been there, and so thank you for that. And thanks, Quinn, for that really powerful poem that kicked us off. I want to be in that future with you. So, as Anne said, my name is Megan Hess. I live in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is in the Upper Peninsula. There's two peninsulas in Michigan, and I'm in the upper one, kind of on the far eastern end next to Ontario. Indigenous peoples, called the Anishinaabe people, have been living in this place for thousands of years. Also known as the Council of the Three Fires. It's the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I think of myself as a dual citizen of sorts because I live in the United States, but I'm also a part of the Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians, which is a sovereign nation of Ojibwe people. I'm also the rural organizing director for We the People Michigan, and we're an organizing organization, meaning the work that we do within our communities is about developing the capacity for community organizing. Our work is in the service of racial and economic justice, because in Michigan, like in a bunch of other places in the United States and definitely around the world, there's a set of political and social elites who benefit off the backs of the working class people, Black, Brown, Native, and immigrant communities. And we believe that if we can build enough power within and also across these communities through organizing, that we can change the material conditions for our people. So we organize, more succinctly, we organize within and across race and class to build and wield power. I joined the organization as an organizer in 2017. That was the same year that we launched, and have since built a team to continue building organizing capacity, both in rural and urban Michigan. And honestly, before then, I didn't consider myself an organizer. I didn't know that there was a term for the kinds of things that I was doing as a volunteer, pulling people together. I was a stay-at-home parent and a former journalist, and I certainly didn't have a power analysis for organizing. My start in what I now know as organizing was about 13 years ago with an Enbridge pipeline that runs under the Straits of Mackinac. And the Straits are arguably the most critical waterway in the Great Lakes. This is Pipeline 5. But I feel like to tell you more of the story, I actually have to go back a lot farther than that. To the early 1900s in Detour, Michigan, which actually is not that far away from where Line 5 lays now. And I want to tell you a little bit about my family and about my great-grandma, whose name was Orline, and she was born in Detour. My great-grandma's heritage was all Native people, and that heritage has since been passed down through the women in my family, my great-grandma, and then my grandma, and my mom, and now me. My great-grandma was born during a time in United States history that was pretty violent for Native peoples. She was born when the U.S. had this strategic and concerted effort for whitewashing Native folks. This was called assimilation, maybe a vocab word familiar to some people. And it began in the 1800s and lasted until the 1980s in Michigan, so within most of our lifetimes. This was like what folks know as like the boarding school and foster care era that some people may have heard about. And as a child, my great-grandma left her family and was put into the foster care system with white families. And I do a lot of reflecting and thinking about her experience there, even now, 3 generations later, because they had to have been unthinkably violent. By the time she became an adult and got married, she was adamant that she was a white person. This little brown kid just decided that she wasn't who she was. And I just do a lot of thinking about like her experiences that would have made that true for her. And this is something that she continued to swear until, she died in her 90s when I was about 10. And after that, for 2 generations, my family lost almost all of the tangible connections that we had to the tribe. It was on purpose, right? Assimilation happened on purpose. It was deliberate. It's the continued genocide of Indigenous people. And by the time my great-grandma was born, the government had mostly ended outright murder and continued the genocide through this assimilation, which I kind of see as a spiritual and cultural murder. And, you know, our family was very nearly a victim, almost. 2 generations later, my mom accidentally learned that we were tribal citizens. It was unknown to us, but through census work, the tribe had kept my great-grandmother's descendants enrolled as members. And so in the late 1970s, when the state of Michigan enacted the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver, which gave some Native people the ability to go to a state university tuition free, my mom was applying to universities and she got a letter in the mail saying she qualified. And everyone was kind of floored. No one had any idea. Years later, my brothers and I were school age, and she sent us to our tribe's charter school that had just opened. And her small choice in that small action kind of swung open a door that had nearly clicked shut for our family. And it gave us a re-entry point to the community, to the tribal community through that school. You know, I have very vivid memories of studying the language and practicing its cadence. We learned traditional practices and, you know, the smells of the sacred medicines, sage, cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass became familiar and comforting. I gained there an Indigenous perspective on history and science, and I built a lot of relationships. And today, I am a parent, and I have 2 kids who go to that same school. And my grandma goes to elders luncheon with other tribal elders every week when there isn't a pandemic. And my mom and I have worked with a traditional healer to know and learn about the clans that we belong to. And I really, you know, cherish this rebuilding and reconnecting. And there is a particular relationship that I built at the school that I mentioned that's still very important to me. And it's a relationship with my middle school social studies teacher, Mrs. Easterday. I give her a lot of credit for radicalizing me because she taught history through the truths of Native people. A while back, it had been like years since I had seen this teacher. And 13 years ago, I noticed that she was putting like notices in the paper and calling people together to protest that pipeline, Enbridge Pipeline 5. And, you know, at the time, it was pretty critical that Native people were raising awareness about just the existence of the pipeline, because until then, the public had been completely unaware that there was this ticking time bomb laying on the floor of the Great Lakes. So, you know, I would show up to protests. I used to show up next to the Mackinac Bridge, which goes over the straits, this beautiful 5-mile stretch. We would show up in front of the tribe's administration building in the Sioux and wave signs at cars who were honking in support. And, you know, like my hatred of Enbridge and my fear that the pipeline would burst absolutely was like a motivator. And yeah, you know, I showed up because I was really angry that Native people were not a part of the decision-making around Line 5, that tribes had been left completely without a seat at the table, which went just wildly in the face of treaty enforced rights that we had, and against like the spiritual responsibility that Native people have to protect the water. But like deep down, you know, what really motivated me was the opportunity to show back up with Mrs. Easterday and to show up for my tribe's community, because I feel like every time I do, it's a giant middle finger to colonization. It's a giant middle finger to the forced assimilation of my great-grandma and to society's idea that somehow she was better as a white lady than being herself. So, you know, that's definitely what motivates me for showing up in environmental justice work. And while I was doing some organizing to shut down Line 5, I also learned a lot of like valuable lessons about what power is and what it means to build it. You know, I learned that showing up at a protest with a sign can be a really valuable tactic, but that tactic in and of itself didn't add up to the power that we needed to actually achieve what we wanted, which was to shut down Line 5. We needed organizing, and we needed a strategy that was about building power. I learned that we needed cross-racial solidarity. You know, I saw white working class people in the Straits who were in the grind in the tourist industry, which is flawed, but, you know, who also wanted to shut the pipeline down because their seasonal tourism jobs, which were their livelihoods, were at stake. And we as Native people didn't have the relationships that we needed to build power with them and increase our chances of success. I also learned that we needed an aspirational vision. You know, I started showing up in places in the central and western UP in communities that had only ever heard Enbridge talk about the absolute need for the pipeline because it guaranteed good jobs and it delivered propane to heat the homes. And I realized that, we were showing up and we were saying shut down line 5, and these families were hearing us say that we didn't want them to put food on the table for their kids, and we didn't want them to have warm homes in the winter. And that we should not only be talking about shutting something down, but simultaneously about building something new that serves our people. So, and to answer some of your questions, like these are the lessons that I bring with me into my work at We the People Michigan, always carrying, my motivations as an Indigenous person for organizing environmental justice. So thank you for letting me just share a little bit about me and about our shared work, and looking forward to hearing from others on the panel.
Megan, that was so terrific. What a wonderful story you have. I hope that somewhere in your busy life you're working on a book, so those of us who want to learn more can hear more about it. I think some of the really powerful things you focused on is the importance of reclaiming history and using the right language to talk about it. And also the personal narratives have so much power. Your story is so powerful. And I love the fact that you have a teacher in there. For all the UD teachers, don't ever underestimate the power of a teacher. But also, I think you've highlighted something that for those of us working on these issues, we know intrinsically, and that is that those who are most affected by the issues need to be the ones at the table. And so I hope you'll keep pushing that message forward. And also just the power of showing up, the power of what one person can do by showing up, and the need for cross-racial solidarity. So you've given us so much to think about, and I want to thank you for that. So Andrea, I am going to ask you to, similar to Megan, maybe you could reflect on the work with the community you've been working with and your background in the fights for environmental justice and how your own identity shapes and informs your work.
Okay, hi. I'm most grateful to the University of Dayton for inviting me to participate in this important and urgent dialogue. First of all, I want to excuse myself for my English is not very good. I don't have the opportunity to speak in English with anyone here, so excuse me and be patient with me, please. Well, I want to talk about 3 things today: the territory, the struggles that arise from the territories, and the role that the Western disciplines such as community social psychologists could have in these processes. The first thing I want to tell you is where I'm from. Well, I want you to try to visualize South America. The long, narrow land that stretches along the southern Pacific Ocean is called Chile. From the center of Chile, practically to the southern tip, is the ancestral Mapuche territory, known as Waimapu. Includes part of southern of Argentina as well. The southern of Waimapu is Huilliche territory, which literally means people of the south. That is where I am from and where my roots as Huilliche, Mapuche Huilliche, okay? The story of the Mapuche people is very complex. Our nation forced two Spanish invaders to recognize our sovereignty south of the Biobío River. Ever since then, the Mapuche nation has resisted cultural, social, religious, and political invasions. We could talk about any of these invasions and how different kinds of struggles have been activated for social, cultural, political, and religious autonomy and resistances. However, today we will talk about one of the most cruel invasions, the capitalism economic invasion, which without a doubt implies all the others. Forest monoculture, for example, began strongly in 1974 at the beginning of the dictatorship in Chile through a government decree which even today subsidized up to the 75% of the cost of pine and eucalyptus plantations. The damage after all these years are evident. A few examples are the violation of sacred spaces, catastrophic water shortage. This is a mainly rainy area. However, there's no water. Erosion, decline of native flora and fauna species. These consequences explained from an environmental perspective reveal the great damage to life and to the territory. But it's even more significant when we understand the damage in terms of how the Mapuche people relate to the land and territory. We defend the Mapu. Mapu is a complex concept to explain. It implies the relationship between the person, the ground, what is under the ground, what inhabits the air. It's not only the earth, but the whole set of elements that are present in a space. So the protection of the Mapu implies all these elements. Therefore, the damage impacts in all levels. It impacts our health, for example, by the loss of medicinal herbs, which have historically been used to cure disease of the body and mind. It affects the spiritual level when sacred spaces are damaged or destroyed. This also has social impact due to the division within the communities between those who support and those who resist these economic activities. I also want to point out that in the past 20 years, environmental encroachment had expanded to other activities such as salmon farming, and now the imminent mining threat and a hydroelectric plant associated with mining activity. As I mentioned earlier, each invention generates particular strategies of resistance. And each one of these actions also generates new forms of repression and persecution from the state, which defends capitalism investments. Increases, for instance, the militarization of the territories. A characteristic of this resistance is that it persists as local struggles, almost in isolation in our specific territories, while the inventions of companies are global. The economic power is coordinated and operated globally upon the various territories, but our struggles are local. This is why the struggles of communities of Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, etc., appear to be separated struggles. But in reality, if we study the economic groups involved, they are the same in all these countries. So the struggles are local, but the inventions of globally coordinated. It is important for me to tell you that I'm a community social psychologist. This is a very well understood in Latin America, and one of the biggest reference here is Ignacio Martín Baró. I'm sure you know who he is. I asked myself in some point how a Western discipline such as social psychology can serve in these cases. For me, it has been a help to understand the role of transnational corporations and the strategies they use to co-opt people and capture their support for devastating environmental projects, corporate social responsibility, or community management programs with professionals such as anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, in general professions that apply social methodologies to get closer to the community. Little by little, they aim to seduce local people through development projects such as Wi-Fi for everyone, installing swimming pools in schools, gyms, transport for children, cooking workshop, knitting workshop, soccer fields, etc. They generally map the situation and analyze the needs of the people, and through these projects, they enter into the communities as sustainable companies' commitment to the community development. The Inter-American Development Bank has several documents with recommendations for transnational companies, especially mining companies, on how they should get involved with the communities and put in action what they call a dialogue, such as cooperating to alleviate scarcity or and poverty. And then, like for me, social psychology is really useful to understand how companies and the state act. But social psychology is not something that I want to use to understand my culture, my identity or my history. For that, we have our own methods, such as oral tradition, spiritual practices, and others to understand who we are and how to perpetuate our ways of understand life. When a research or intervention project is proposed, I think it's essential to ask ourselves who will benefit from it. If a research project seeks to systematize, for example, the struggle of territory, that information is very useful for companies because in this way they learn how we organize ourselves, how we resist, etc. In that case, the companies will benefit, not our local companies. That is why we need a discipline that seeks to expose the problem associated with the implementation of these transnational projects, the violation of social, political, and cultural rights, the consequences of divisions within the communities, the health consequences, the territorial consequences in general, and about all the strategies companies use to implement their projects. There are many ways to defend our Mapu, and as our emblematic cry says, if one person falls, 10 will rise. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you for being willing to deliver your remarks in English. I'm sorry that we were not set up to be able to listen to you in Spanish, but I appreciate you doing that. And you've given us so much to think about. I think you've helped me think differently about strategies of resistance and particularly the intersection of local movements against global power. I spend all day in my job with communities around the globe, and sometimes I lose sight of what an unfair fight that really is. When you put it that way, I think that tells us that, we have to think differently about it. So social psychology as a way to understand companies and what is going on there, I think is very savvy, and I'm eager to learn more. I also want to take just a moment to thank Tracy Jaffe, who is a UD faculty member in history, who helped to arrange for Andrea to be with us today. And you can see we owe her a debt of gratitude because Andrea has added so much. So thank you for that. Professor Steele, I wondered if you could share from your research the thoughts you have on just environmentalism, and particularly how it pertains to Indigenous people.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation, and I've learned so much and been blessed by Rob and Quinn's words as well. And I thank the University of Dayton for inviting me to talk about my scholarship, and also in a community that welcomes that the idea that our faith traditions often animate our concern for others and for being good brothers and sisters in the world. My previous co-panelists have put me in mind today of something that Dr. Martin Luther King said in his letter from Birmingham jail. And that was on the interconnectedness of all things. That he said, we are, I'm paraphrasing his eloquence, but we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, he said, tied in a single garment of destiny. And what affects one directly affects all indirectly, and that we prosper together or fall together. And I think my co-panelists have helped illuminate that truth from Dr. King. And I wanted to tell you, asked me to talk a little bit about just environmentalism and indigenous resilience, which have been two recent papers that I've written. And I want to begin that by telling you a story. I'm from the Seneca Nation. Our traditional territories are in what is now Western New York, part of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Whatever grade it is when little kids do their, they learn about the tribes in some way in elementary school, 4th or 5th grade, a little girl was learning about the tribes of New York, and her dad asked if she could call me and talk to me for her research project. And usually these kind of projects involve the children sort of making a model of a traditional home or something like that. And so she called me just cute as can be, and she asked a question that has resonated with me and has informed some of my scholarship. She said, when you were a Seneca Indian, what was that like? What did you eat? What did you wear? And it illustrated to me the sense in the United States that indigeneity is a relic of the past, and that was the expectation from the beginning in the United States, that the tribes would sort of fade away. As George Washington said, the savage, like the wolf, would retreat in the face of civilization. And I think along with perhaps the iPhone, the founders of this nation would be very surprised to know that there are not just such a thing as indigenous peoples in the United States today, but that in so many ways we are thriving and prepared to be contributors to this nation's prosperity. And in particular, in those instances where I think there is a lot of wisdom that is preserved in the cultures of the tribes. And I'm not talking about offering that up for appropriation or misappropriation, but in the spirit of humility, what can we learn from the experience of the tribes? These repeated assaults on cultural sovereignty, on spiritual traditions, on the family and identity, physical assaults on the environment and territories of the sacred lands of the tribes. How have the tribes survived that? How is there such a thing as a tribe and a Native person in the United States when it was the full might and plan and legal, military and cultural strategy, as Megan was talking about, to eradicate that indigeneity, to force the assimilation of tribal peoples? How did we survive that, and what can be learned from that survival? And I think that does inform what I mean by just environmentalism. We're currently in a world that is reeling from assaults, right? As was mentioned, climate change, the pandemic, and we could usefully turn to the way the tribes have endured assaults and come out strong. And what principles of resilience might we learn? And so there are a couple of ideas that I wanted to share briefly. It all goes back to this interconnectedness idea that I mentioned from Dr. King, and that will inform also my discussion of just environmentalism in just a moment. But let me just real quickly share my screen, that some of the principles of, I'll say, indigenous wisdom from the Haudenosaunee tradition, which is my heritage. You have some of these ideas that have helped the tribes to endure are found in such things as these, what we call wampum belts. This is one of the more well-known wampum. It's called the Two-Row Wampum. You see the two purple lines running parallel. Those are intended to represent two sovereigns. It was between the Dutch and what was called the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. And this was a treaty where they represent, the two purple lines represent two canoes traveling side by side down the river, neither endeavoring, they said, to steer the other's canoe. And so how do we get along in such a multicultural setting? How do we embrace the sovereignty of tribes as part of the resilience that across the Americas that we need to imbue? How do we endeavor not to steer one another's tribes, canoes, but to respect as co-sovereigns the indigenous people? Another principle is called the one dish, one spoon principle. This is a representation of that, and it means that our resources are shared. This wampum belt, the one dish, one spoon, whereby we have to share, and that selfishness, the kind of thing that Andrea was talking about, exploitation, that it has consequences for all of us. And then as Megan was saying earlier about the people who were hearing the message of their jobs being lost, traditionally when we think of environmental justice, we think of the location of disfavored uses, the siting of disfavored uses in poor and vulnerable neighborhoods. A more just environmentalism, moving toward a more intersectional environmentalism, will also think about when we take steps, when we're able to, because of Megan's good organizing and things like that, when we are able to take protective measures for the environment, to understand that those steps have costs and externalities as well, and that to be mindful of the way that those environmental protections might impact the poor, the vulnerable, the voiceless, and to include them as stakeholders, to invite those voices into the conversation. And so I think one of the main principles that I would leave with you about the way the tribes have modeled resilience at great cost is the prioritization for care of the vulnerable. One of the fascinating debates we've seen in the United States during the pandemic has been, will one person, will the individual do something that will benefit the whole, or will we prioritize sort of selfishness? And I think that many indigenous cultures model a way for the individual to be part of the whole and to think about what is best for the whole. We're all interconnected, that I can't be, as Dr. King said, what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and vice versa. So thank you so much for inviting my participation in this conversation, and I look forward to it being the start of good things to come.
Professor Steele, thank you so much for contributing your perspectives. And I certainly appreciated that you brought the faith traditions into this, and recognizing UD as a community of faith that embraces all of these things, and in particular to speak about Indigenous resilience, which is something that I think we need to hear much, much more about. And as you said, I think can guide us at a time when resilience is a word we're all clinging to, trying to figure out how to be that. I think the more we can learn from those tried and true approaches and the agency that these Native tribes have had, and that we've lost the stories. We've as Megan and you both have said, we've not only lost them, we've deliberately buried them, quite literally. And so I think, you know, finding that again and the powerful imagery of one dish, one spoon, you know, that's something that as we look now at a world that is so motivated by individual gain and by greed and by materialism and by instant fame on, you know, every platform and social media that you can think of, the notion of caring for the vulnerable and doing what's best for the whole is something that I just don't think we could hear enough about. So I want to thank you again for your perspectives. And let me now turn to Soledad Garcia Munoz, who is here with us. And we're so privileged to have you because I'm hoping that you will now be able to give us really a regional human rights perspective to all of these issues that we've been hearing about. And in particular, your thoughts on what is the right to a healthy environment as articulated by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in a decision that was made last summer. So we're very eager to hear from you, and you get to solve all these challenges for us. So no pressure on you, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the University of Dayton for the invitation to this very important event in the spirit of the defense of human rights defenders that's inspired the work of Monsignor Romero. I am deeply honored to be part of this amazing panel. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Megan, Andrea, Vitalis. It has been a pleasure to listen your very inspiring interventions. My presentation will be focused on highlighting the advance of the protection of the right to a healthy environment within the framework of the Inter-American system of human rights, the role that Redesca has in this regard, and what are the challenges and opportunities on this issue in the near future. I am also going to apologize for my English and congratulate Andrea on hers. Definitely, we need more than ever the wisdom of the indigenous people of all the Americas to protect humanity and to protect the Mother Earth, La Pachamama. So it has been really inspiring to me also to listen the wisdom of indigenous people in this panel. In relation to the advances in the protection to the right of a healthy environment in the Inter-American system, in this first point, I would like to point out that the system is actively focusing on tackling the climate and environmental crisis head-on from its different institutions and mandates. In this sense, we have to recognize the important achievements that have been made in recent years, especially since both the court and the commission, as you know, they both are the main bodies in the Inter-American system to protect human rights. The court and the commission both have recognized the indivisibility of civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights in the continent. As very well said Michaelis, all of us, we are connected, and the same applies to human rights. People need water as well, health as well, the civil and political rights at the same time. But we come from a way where the civil and political rights has been prioritized in relation to the economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. This is why my mandate was created in the commission. And the right to a healthy environment at a normative level is contemplated in Article 11 of the Protocol of San Salvador. As well, it is part of the rights that involve Article 26 of the American Convention. Also, there are several provisions related to aspects pertaining to sustainable and integral development on Chapter 7 of the OAS Charter. Furthermore, Article 15 of the International Democratic Charter states that democratic regimes are vital for the effective protection of the environment. This comes in line with the transversalization of that we call the democratic governance of the environment. In that sense, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights in the Lagos del Campo case against Peru established the autonomy of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights in the Inter-American system. And through the adoption of the advisory opinion number 23 in 2017, the court states the right to a healthy environment as an autonomous right that can be protected under the mechanisms of the Inter-American system. This is an historic advisory opinion. At the Lagos del Campo is an historic ruling, an historic case in the Inter-American system. In this sense, it is important to consider that for the court, the right to a healthy environment, unlike other rights, protects the components of the environment, such as forests, rivers, and seas, as legal interests in themselves, even in the absence of the certainty of evidence of a risk to individuals. Further on, it indicates that this means that it protects nature and the environment, not only because of the benefits they provide to humanity or the effects that their degradation may have on other human rights, such as health, life, or personal integrity, but because of their importance to the other living organisms with which we share the planet that also merit protection in their own rights. With this strong wording, the link between the protection of the environment and its impact on human well-being is more than established in the Inter-American system through the court. Beyond this anthropocentric approach, which is valid since we are talking about human rights institution, the court also notes that the trend in the region is to move forward to the legal recognition of rights to nature. And I have to say that I am in favor, very in favor of this trend. However, it is important to note that from the constitutional recognition given in various countries in the region, the recognition of right to nature also comes in line with the solidification of the rights of indigenous people, particularly the right to the protection of their territory and cultural identity. This is especially true from the Inter-American system with the ruling in the Laca-Hontat case, where the court issued a landmark interpretation of the protection of the territory of these indigenous people in Argentina, where the analysis on how environmental harm can also affect other rights, such as the right to food, health, or water. By this, the court has helped shape the response from the system on this matter, but the Commission has also done some pivotal work on the issue, especially with the creation of Redesca and the mandate it holds. Redesca is the second special rapporteurship that has been created by the Commission in the entire history of the Commission. It was created 3 years and some months ago. I have the honor to be the first person in ruling in leading this effort for the Commission. And it's an historic step of the Commission, as the Commission needs strongly endorsing the indivisibility of human rights, the interconnection of all human rights, recognizing that the Commission needs to push the agenda of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights in the Americas. And this is especially important today, where we are living a pandemic that is a health crisis, but this is also an economic, social, and environmental crisis. And having explained the work that the court has done, the Commission, and in particular the mandate of Redesca, has had a need to have a central role in consolidating the protection of the environment as a priority in the agenda of the Commission and of the Inter-American system as a whole. In this sense, as a brief introduction, as I said, Redesca is the second special rapporteurship established by the Commission, and we work in all the pillars of the Commission, in all the mechanisms of the Commission, which are the protection, promotion, and monitoring of the situation of human rights in the Americas. As such, regarding protection, Redesca has been actively advising the Commission on precautionary measures and on petitioning cases that had been submitted to the system. In this sense, for instance, there are two precautionary measures that are based on the protection of the right to health and other rights, but that the situation that the measures come from environmental pollution. Such measures are the Rio Mesapa situation in Honduras and the situation of the Rio Santiago River from Mexico. Additionally, in regards to the promotion and monitoring mandate, Redesca has been actively drafting reports and statements on this issue. In our recent annual reports, we have included a specific section that make a diagnosis of the situation of the right to a healthy environment, particularly on the effects of climate change of human rights. This is a crucial line and a strategic line of action for the mandate in the second period of my mandate. This also comes in line with a worrying trend in the region towards the danger of being an environmental defender and activist as a life-threatening profession, as well through the report on business and human rights that we also, sorry, the alarm is indicating me I am finishing my time, but I will finish in some minutes, it's okay? We deliver a very important report, the first in the history of the Inter-American system, precisely in business and human rights, on business and human rights. I think that also can be of interest for you, especially because we also confront the most challenging situation and context in our region, including, of course, the situation of indigenous people in relation to business and human rights. And also in this report, we are including a particular item regarding the question of climate change by the first time in the history of the Inter-American system. As well, Redesca has been actively engaging with different stakeholders to promote the issue with the Commission itself. As such, there have been a series of hearings held during the period of session of the Commission, where the issues of climate change, environmental degradation, and the effects of extractive industries have on the full enjoyment of human rights has been discussed. Redesca has been a vital player to not only impulse the inclusion of an environmental agenda within the Inter-American system, but to also become an active stakeholder in the different environmental and climate forums that are currently established. This has helped shape, for instance, the climate policy agenda within the region to have a bolder stance from a human rights approach, securing not only that climate action has an inclusive agenda, but also that the well-being of the most vulnerable people is being kept at the highest interest. And of course, regarding challenges and opportunities, with all this work, there is still big challenges ahead that have to be answered by the international community and by states. The situation of nature and environmental defenders still is a serious issue that permeates the entire region, but that has a deadly effect in Latin America. The region is still considered by many as the most dangerous one for environmental defenders, and as such, in the duty of all interested parties to hold state and business too accountable for the safety and integrity of those who are protecting the land. Fortunately, next week, the Escazú Agreement will be entering into force, and thus a new tool for demanding governments to exercise their full power to protect the rights of those who are protecting our home can be demanded. This is just a first step, but we cannot have more cases like those of Berta Cáceres in Honduras and others who have failed due to the aggressive persecution of defenders in the region. From Redesca, we are looking forward to work with all of those who are willing to provide with more information in this matter, either coming from the state, national human rights institution, civil society, or universities, This is a task that entails everybody, and a solution can be achieved when we all work together. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por su paciencia con mi inglés. Gracias.
Thank you so much. And again, I apologize that we didn't have this set up to have simultaneous translation, but you've done a beautiful job of expressing some really important things. And I think it's so appropriate that you ended on the note that you did, which is about the personal safety and the protection of those who are trying to protect the environment, trying to protect rights. If there was anything that we should be reflecting on with the Romero Award, it's the ultimate price that so many people have paid to, including Saint Romero. And so I think that focus is something that I have seen less and less of, frankly. When I started in my career, a personal story, you know, I was working with Latin American journalists, and there used to be accompaniment approaches that were put in place because at the time, the idea that if an American was, you know, with Latin American journalists, maybe they'd be less likely to kidnap them, they'd be less likely to inflict violence on them. And while I think the notions were probably flawed of what sort of power or prestige Americans may have had, I think the point was that accompaniment, that we're standing in solidarity and that our goal is to protect the rights of those who are protecting others. And you know, what could be more important? So thank you for not just speaking of personal safety, but also to the regional legal frameworks, the you know, legal entitlements that we need to be so focused on. And I also want to wish you the best as we move into the question and answer. I couldn't miss a chance to say thank you for serving as the inaugural Special Rapporteur for Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights. Many of us have been first in doing something, and it's hard. It's just really hard to be first. So, you know, we wish you all success, and you have the support of this community, let me say that. So we do have a question that I want to share with the panel. Thank you to our audience who's put one forward. Those of you who haven't had a chance, please do. We're going to move into about, I think, 15 minutes or so of question and answer. And the first one is, first, thank you all for the great and informative panel, this question says, and asking that as we talk about terms like resiliency and sustainability, even when those terms are framed as a just transition and the importance of racial equity or environmental justice, those terms still reside and are situated in the existing political, economic, and social systems. And the person asking this question says those systems have domination over people and nature to make a profit, and that's the core. So, you know, he or she is asking for some understanding of what a new political, economic, and or social system based on the indigenous values could look like. So I feel like kicking off with this question could take us to the end of the session. It's a very insightful question. I think it's a challenging question. I think in some of your remarks, we've heard some of the, what I would think could be threads of an answer, but let me see if we can maybe first turn to Professor Steele, who maybe you can offer some thoughts for us.
Sure, I really appreciate the urge to reimagine the world with Indigenous values. I think one of the things that is built in, at least in the United States, and I don't mean to be so specific about the United States, that's my area of study, but I think these principles have flowed out from the United States as well. But we had baked in at the very beginning the doctrine of discovery, which sort of baked in which said that you know, that essentially white European interest in the land and farming the land, or other, as Soledad said, other extractive uses of the land, were the highest and best use of the land. And that has continued to inform the way we think about what is best when we have to shift externalities around. So much of the wealth of the United States and wealth development has been a driving value of the United States. So much of that wealth came from the labor of people who were enslaved and from the resources of indigenous people. But it was sort of adjudged each time that happened that those populations could bear the brunt, while the other people reaped the rewards. And I don't know that we have changed that founding value very much. Megan works with Line 5 and Enbridge. This is what we saw at the heart of the Standing Rock protests a couple of years ago, that this is what the world might look like informed by indigenous values in one sense, right? That there are people in indigenous communities whose job it is, like whose role in the community is to speak for the water, to speak for that which can't speak for itself. That's the, I'm sorry if I've forgotten the word, Andrea, like the Moapa, or the whole ecosystem, right? And they were speaking for the water and saying that the Dakota Access Pipeline represented this massive threat, and that who speaks for the water, who speaks for the plants, who speaks for the air, and how do those values factor into the choices we make about our shared resources? Who gets to hold the spoon in the one dish, one spoon? And how do we regulate that? So I love the idea of reimagining a world. We have to navigate the world we're in, but I do think it is productive to imagine a world that didn't value wealth creation above all, and that didn't look at the earth as just a set of resources to extract, but as a stewardship over which you had a sacred responsibility.
So much. That's really, I think, great insights and helpful. And I appreciate your perspective in saying that we still, even if we reimagine a new world, and hopefully we do, we have to navigate the world we sit within. And that, to me, is the core of any effective advocacy and activism. It doesn't mean you accept it, but it means you navigate it. I'm also going to have to just thank Soledad Garcia Munoz for her time. She has another commitment. And so I know many of you may have had questions directly for her, but we've taken a lot of your time, and I know you're very busy. So she is off to go do the important work that she does. And we want to thank you again. Please, everyone, join me in thanking her for dedicating her time to this panel today.
Thank you. See you soon.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Are there any of the other panelists who'd like to comment on that first question?
I could maybe offer some words, although I don't know, I think I will be as articulate. You know, for us, visioning in organizing is really important. We like to joke that we are visionary organizers, which means we kind of know where we want to get to, but really don't necessarily know how, what pathways forward. And so it's a lot of navigation. A practice that I think informs some of this work, and maybe gets to some of the question that we've got, is just defining what success is. And often, you know, right now we think of success as accumulating wealth, accumulating property, holding positions of power and status. And it's some of the, in navigating toward this world that I think we want to get to, it's important to define what success is for us. Does that mean we are successful when everybody is fed? Does that mean we are successful when everybody feels safe? Does that mean we are successful when everybody has clean water to drink? Or will we continue to kind of define success as this, you know, wealth piece? So that's something that I hold on to a lot in organizing, and I think it's valid, I think, for this question as well. I do love what Michaelan said about like people who are representing that which can't speak for itself. I did hear of an interesting idea. I wish I could give credit to it, but it was an elected body of people, and one of the representatives jobs was to speak for the future, and to be that voice in conversation and in decision making. What you won't be able to do it perfectly, but to have someone there asking, like, how would the future feel about this decision that we're we've got in front of us? And so that's another interesting thing that I think feels important as we navigate toward the world that we want it to be.
Thank you very much.
If I may just
Yes, please.
add to that real quick. Thank you. One of the indigenous principles of resilience that I didn't have time to talk about, but which Megan is referencing in part, at least from the Haudenosaunee tradition, I know this varies in different indigenous traditions, it's called the 7 generations principle, that the representatives to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were charged by the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy with considering the consequences of their choices on the next 7 generations. How would that change the way Congress deliberates if they were responsible, if they could be removed for the failure, for acting in self-interest and the failure to consider the consequences spanning out for the next 7 generations? That was their responsibility. I know that principle shows up in different ways, but that's from the Haudenosaunee tradition. So thank you for reminding me that, Megan.
7 generations, that's a very, if you think about what that means in terms of your children's children, it's a very long time down the road, and exactly what we need to be thinking about for particularly the environment, where so much damage has been done, and the urgency to reclaim and restore is really very, very stark. I'm going to ask Megan a question that came from the audience. It was directed to you, and I will invite others to reflect on this question and apply it to their work if they choose. But Megan, have the skills and knowledge you learned during the work protesting Line 5 been helpful in reimagining the work you may be doing in conjunction with Line 3? So that is specific for Megan. And for the others of you, I would say, have the skills that you've learned during the work you've been doing, have they set you up for what you see are the next challenges? Or, what skills are you missing that you feel you need to have in order to be the most effective?
That's a good question. I will slightly disappoint with the answer, but maybe also have something to say as well. I don't do work on Line 3. I have a lot of colleagues who are incredible humans, doing that very important work much farther to the west of me. But I do, and also just to say, there's a special place in hell for Enbridge, and creating these like multiple crises, kind of in the United States simultaneously. But I will say that I have, like, the lessons, of having cross-racial solidarity are, I think, valid everywhere, and having an aspirational vision for what it is that you want is useful everywhere. The ways that our communities are siloed means that we can't together build the power that we need to get to the outcomes that we deserve and want. And that the divisions, the divides between many communities is on purpose. It's very intentional, it's very deliberate. And so it's much easier said than done to build cross-racial solidarity and to be building across, race and class and identity, but it's vital. And the learning and the relationship building that has to happen there is vital. And I also think about, the aspirational vision piece, to not just articulate doom and gloom, but to know where it is, kind of, Quinn's poem is an example of that, where it is that we want to get to, is really important. And often, our visions in environmental justice, or I guess the emotions that we evoke in talking about environmental justice, are immobilizing ones. Often we, submit a vision that is full of doom and gloom and fire and hell and brimstone. And it's not the kind of the mobilizing emotions that we need our people to feel. And so to offer something that is aspirational, that serves all of our communities, also feels important for some of the work that's happening around Line 3.
Thank you so much. Are there others who want to, either Professor Steele or Andrea, think about this? question in terms of your, next challenges. I mean, Andre, I'd be particularly interested to hear for you in terms of, what are your next challenges and what does success look like?
Oof. It's difficult. We have a long history of struggles and resistances, that's for sure. And I think one of the things that happened is the government, the state, the transnational corporations, they usurpate our lands. And that is a very big struggle we have to maintain. And because maybe he take our territories, but they have not been able to steal our right to dream and fight for recovery them the territories and fight for our autonomy and freedom. And I think that is the most important thing right now. And we don't want all these transnational corporations in our territory, that's for sure. And I think, okay, it's not all the nation, because nation is very, that concept is it's not all the time very clear, but I think there are a big part of the nation who want that and fight for that. That is why in this moment we have political prisoners, we have a lot of repression in our territories. We have to be careful all the time, and not just with the state do, also with the media, who they're not nice with us. For a long time, they say Mapuches very lazy people, they don't like to work or things like that. And then they're drunk, they like to drink and very drunker. And now we're terrorism. And the last things is we are drug dealer, They found a way to try to put in the subjectivity of the people the word things about us. But in some way, I think we don't care. We have to recover. we know who we are, and it's important to have a very strong identity. It's very important to have very strong idea and our dreams very clear. And we need our territories. We have to recover, and that's all we have to fight for.
Well, thank you. Those are important life lessons for anyone to hear. As long as you know who you are and you know what you're fighting for, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. So what a powerful and positive note I think we will end on, because we are at time. And I'm sure we could continue to talk all day because there's so much here. But I want to thank this really wonderful panel who shared their time and their insights with us. I want to thank again everyone from the University of Dayton who was so instrumental for putting this all together. Quinn, wonderful, wonderful poetry. I hope people will check out her site and see more of her work. And, just also draw your attention to the fact that we do have the Romero Human Rights Ceremony, and that we will continue the celebration of the work of Indigenous environmental justice defenders. And so you will be able to register for that. Thanks to everyone, and I wish you all success and appreciation.